So welcome and thank you very much for joining us today for our latest CAARI online lecture. I'm Lindy Crew, CAARI's director, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Alison South. Alison is well known to many of you for her excavations and research at multiple sites in the area of Kalavasos village in the Vassilikos Valley, one of the richest archaeological regions of the island. Her long connection with Cyprus began as an undergraduate studying ancient history and archaeology at the University of Birmingham, later moving to postgraduate study at University College London. Her excavation experience includes sites in the UK and around Europe, and she first came to Cyprus in 1969 to work at the site of IIA-C under the direction of Eddie Peltenberg. She was digging there and had to be evacuated from the island during the invasion of 1974. She returned to Cyprus in 1975 and joined the Vassilikos Valley project, directed by Ian Todd in 1976, which ran until 1999. Since this time, Alison has been working on publishing this extensive work in the Vassilikos Valley, along with Ian Todd, which includes excavation and survey of Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age sites, as well as more recent periods. Alison has given multiple lectures, published around 50 articles, and edited multi-authored site reports. She's also renowned for her willingness to share her data and to help students and researchers addressing questions on the Cypriot Bronze Age. In 2018, along with Linda Hewlin and Jennifer Webb, I was very happy to be one of the editors and contributors to the volume Structures of Inequality on Bronze Age Cyprus, Studies in Honour of Alison K. South. We held a lovely book launch in those pre-pandemic times in the CAARI Library. And the book is available through the Studies in Mediterranean Archaeology, CIMA website. Alison has recently been awarded a 3-year Shelby White and Leon Levy Programme for Archaeological Publications grant for publication of the Kalavasos Ayios Dhimitrios architecture and stratigraphy. It is the tombs of this important late Bronze Age site that we will hear about today. Our lecture this evening is entitled Voices from the Grave, a Late Bronze Age Population from Kalavasos and Their Tombs. You may gather from this title that there will be images of human skeletons shown, so I'm giving notice of this for those who may feel uncomfortable to be prepared to look away at certain points in the lecture. I would now like to invite Alison South to take the screen. Thank you. Perfect.
Yes, how do I do my slideshow?
And just use your arrows. Yeah, okay.
Wait a minute. Yes, okay. It's not filling the whole screen, but never mind. This is my first Zoom presentation ever, so fingers crossed that I don't mess up somehow. I'm going to talk about the people of late Bronze Age Kalavasos Ayios Dhimitrios in Cyprus, as we know them from their tombs, bones, and grave goods, whatever the purpose of grave goods is exactly. This evidence, despite various limitations, as usual in archaeology, should contribute much on subjects including the physical anthropology, ages, health, arrangement of people in their tombs, tomb types, sizes, distribution and relationship to architecture, nature and function of the artifacts placed in the tombs, implications of many of these for the economic system and international trade, and more. In the many years since we started excavating these tombs, way back in 1979, in recent years, there have been many new developments in studies of tombs and the people in them. Priscilla Kaswani's wonderful book, drawing it all together about Bronze Age tombs and their inhabitants, and several theses on people's bones from tombs, and recently all sorts of studies of the artifacts and their purpose, of the bones of infants in tombs, women, etc. So there are lots of exciting new things happening which need to be taken into account. Although I might make very few mentions actually of evidence from other Cypriot sites, I keep this rather limited to have time for as clear a picture as possible of what emerges from the Kalavasos evidence. I should mention before we get any further that Ayios Dhimitrios is not the only late Bronze Age cemetery in the Basilikos Valley. There were also a few late Bronze Age tombs among the numerous, mainly early and middle Bronze Age chamber complexes under the present Kalavasos village, where there is a little evidence for late Bronze Age buildings, and at Mangia, the circle near to KAD, on the flat-topped hill east of the river, only 800 meters from Ayios Dhimitrios, similarly with a few indications of settlement. We won't discuss these here, except to mention importantly that Jack Moyer, who studied most of our bones, also studied those from Mangia to get a better overview of the population, and so they are included in some of his studies. The next closest late Bronze Age cemeteries are at Moroni, about 7 kilometers to the southwest, excavated by the British Museum in the 1890s and by Gerald Cadogan and Sturt Manning's teams. Many of you will be familiar with Ayios Dhimitrios, and for those who are not, I'm only going to give a very brief introduction here, although I can see from the audience that there are some who are perhaps not totally familiar with it. Located in the middle of the south coast, it was a large settlement of about 8 to 10 hectares, 3.5 kilometers from the sea and about 7 kilometers south of a modern and partly ancient copper mining area. As was normal in the Cypriot late Bronze Age, the underground chamber tombs were located within the inhabited area. Occupation lasted from late Cypriot 2A through 2C, with the majority of surviving architectural remains belonging to the latter period. A sophisticated town plan included long straight streets, for example, here in the west part of the site, east part, long straight streets and building types ranging from small domestic houses to fairly large industrial buildings, and a large ashlar administrative complex where much wealth in the form of olive oil was concentrated. 21 numbered tombs were excavated by our project, the Basilikos Valley project, during 1979 to 98, of which 8 were published in 1989. The rest are in an advanced stage of preparation for publication in another CIMA volume. And this talk is a sort of very rough preliminary version of the discussion and conclusions for that volume. But I hope that some of you may have questions and suggestions which will help me improve it. I should perhaps mention, to avoid confusion, that we haven't been consistent in the way we allocated numbers to tomb chambers. Normally the largest chamber leading off a dromos would be given the next unused tomb number, but a smaller subsidiary chamber, or the very small niches in the dromos, we sometimes gave their own new number or the main tomb number with an A added, such as tomb 16 and 16A. As always in a big publication project, I'm deeply indebted to a number of specialists who have contributed enormously to the understanding of different aspects of the material. Starting with the physical anthropologists, without whom we wouldn't be able to get to know the ancient people at all, I warmly thank them here. And of course, many thanks to all the skilled excavators who often worked without a break in difficult conditions. Much of what I say here will be closely based on the specialist reports, but I am responsible for any errors. By the way, as I see Jack Moyer, the bones man, and Louise Steele, a pottery person, are here, they could always help to answer questions, perhaps. Ringed in red are the excavation areas where we have found tombs, that is almost all of them. That swathe across the middle of the site is where the present Nicosia-Limassol motorway was created and cut through and destroyed the middle of the site, for those who haven't driven on it. Thus, some of the tombs that we excavated, especially these in the middle of the site, were excavated in dire emergency during road construction, and scientific excavation of the areas around them was impossible. Even in areas which were carefully excavated, we have rarely reached bedrock everywhere, so there may be further as yet undiscovered tombs. Thus, we're dealing with a quite random sample depending on the chances of excavation. And to see them in the landscape, I'll just outline the settlement is here, and about 1/3 of it is off the slide to the left there. And the red fat stars are the tombs. This is a much smaller number of tombs than has been investigated at some sites, such as the approximately 180 found by various missions beneath late Bronze Age encamy, or the many hundreds, even thousands, at some early and middle Bronze Age cemeteries, at which period tombs were extramural and so can be excavated without having to deal with settlement layers above them. And there is far more opportunity to study the numbers, variety, and arrangement of tombs. Another consideration is that the geology within the site varies. In some parts, mainly in the higher western areas, tombs such as the large and symmetrical tomb 18 on the left were entirely cut in Havara, in which it was possible to create a very neatly cut chamber with little or no danger of collapse. Tomb 6 section, you probably can't see it well, but it's partly cut in the Havara, and then the lower part is in this very loose pebbly conglomerate, in which would collapse if you tried to dig the whole chamber in it. The roof would collapse. The conglomerate is not only prone to collapse, making the creation of features such as benches or niches difficult, but it can be extremely damp, so much so that we believe there must have been water pooling in the chambers in winter seasons, with very adverse effects on the preservation of bones, ivory, and some other materials. We often find what we call bone soup on the floor, full of sort of silty deposit, full of a lot of small conglomerate pebbles, and full of white flakes of bone and ivory, green flakes of bronze corrosion, minute sherds, and very small objects. What's happened? Doesn't want to do my next slide at the moment. Why? Just a minute, go back one. Does it work? Yes. Yes. Sometimes we even find, we often find the objects sitting in very silty layers, which clearly accumulated when there was water standing in the tomb. And sometimes, as these two pots in tomb 13, it even looks as if they've been floating about happily, bottoms up in the wet silt. In yet other parts of the site, especially in the southeast, the loose conglomerate, or sometimes silt or clay, is found just below the topsoil, and it probably wasn't possible to create chamber tombs at all. Because of these factors, incomplete excavation in many areas, unsuitability of the bedrock for tombs in others, it's not really possible to extrapolate from the available evidence to make any estimate of how many tombs may have originally existed within the settlement. Clearly, there is ample space for hundreds. By various methods, the population of the site can be estimated at anywhere from over 3,000 to 850. To keep it simple, using a modest figure of 100 persons per hectare, and making allowance for open areas and some types of buildings, such as industrial, not having been used for habitation, let's say very loosely, a living generation of 800 people might need 160 tombs in use if an average of 5 individuals were interred in each. 1,200 people would need 250 tombs, and so on. All these tombs are basically of the type with a rectangular or square dromos cut in the bedrock until it was deep enough to start cutting a stomion, only just wide enough for a living or dead body to get through it, leading into a chamber anywhere from 2.5 to 11.5 square meters in area, which might be approximately circular, oval, kidney-shaped, or almost square. Other features such as rock cut or built benches or pillars or projections to help support the roof were sometimes present. We have found no pit or shaft tombs and no pot burials. Rather than leaving discussion of bones to the end, as if they were an afterthought, let's give them a big mention before we get any further, as they were the ones creating their tombs and burial customs. The soil conditions are not kind to the skeletal remains, and even our best preserved individuals, such as skeleton 1 from tomb 11 shown here, or the lady on the bench in tomb 13, were far from in good condition. It is essential to have a physical anthropologist present to study and measure the bones in situ, if at all possible. Very few complete skeletons are found, and most of the bone study involves identification and counting of fragments, small bones, and teeth to arrive at a minimum number of individuals. The actual number of people interred in the various burial chambers is likely to have been more than could be identified from their bones. We were fortunate to have Jack Moyer and later Sherry Fox available to study the human remains while the tombs were being excavated. I only make very brief remarks here based on Jack Moyer's summary of what can be said about the deceased from Ayios Dhimitrios tombs, which will be published in our volume in a few months, we hope. And Jack combined this information with the bones from nearby Kalavasos Mangia, which together give a sample of 95 individuals. I think that's one of the largest samples from one well bone studied site from this period so far, although there are many more good bone studies coming along. Jack's 95 people, there were well, no, as an example, for 42 individuals from the northeast area tombs of KAD, there were 10 infants, 7 children or early adolescents, and 25 late adolescents or adults. Infants and children are well represented among these bones, unlike the ones from early and middle Bronze Age cemetery in Kalavasos village, which Jack also studied. That's a big change from one period to another. Several of our skulls have show evidence for head shaping. We haven't yet started any DNA studies. We're investigating this, but the difficult travel and virus situation during the last couple of years has slowed down this process. Just a minute. sorry, that one, you can possibly see the head shaping on skeleton from tomb 13, who has also had a nice piece of gypsum placed there to protect her head. When an ancient person at Kalavasos died, how did their friends or family decide what to do about burying them? We know that many infants and adolescents were deposited in niches cut in the sides of a dromos or in subsidiary small chambers, although their remains were also found together with adults in the large chambers. Anyway, if there wasn't a large chamber open or easily accessible, these younger people could be decently buried in a dromos niche without having to open up a large chamber. However, you would have to unbackfill quite a large dromos. We really don't know whether these were normally later moved to a large chamber, but they may have been, as the niches are often found empty. To bury an adult, either a new tomb could be created or an existing one opened up, its location probably being easily remembered as the tombs were among inhabited buildings. But we do have some evidence for the corners of the dromoi being marked. We can only guess that the time-consuming labor of creating a new full-size chamber may have been undertaken only for someone who had considerable status within the family or whatever group it was. But that's only guessing. We believe that creating a new large tomb chamber would have taken several days, even if the ancient diggers didn't have to work with care and sieve everything as we do. Excavating tomb 13, the second largest we have at just over 11 square meters area, we removed 1,215 buckets of very heavy soil full of the conglomerate pebbles. That is about 17.5 tons. And the original excavators had to remove more, as there was quite a bit of empty space in the upper part of the chamber when we started. In the early stages of opening up a new chamber, digging is slow and awkward due to lack of space. Diggers have to work lying down or in crouched positions, and all excavated soil has to be passed out in buckets or baskets through a narrow stomion, which is only just wide enough for a living or dead person. In fact, a rather fat person usually can't squeeze through. Thus, the dead person would have to be kept for several days, presumably, before their tomb was ready. To give an idea of the range of tomb types and how they were used, I will run quickly through some varied examples, but without mentioning all tombs individually. The tombs found in the earlier excavations were mostly of small to medium size. That is on this slide. These ones, contrasting with the more elite tombs found in the northeast area. The biggest ones here, or mostly found in the northeast area. The tombs found in the earliest excavations in advance of the new road construction were excavated in difficult conditions, all at least partly damaged by the roadwork and perhaps earlier events, either with the uppermost parts of their chambers and dromi missing, or in one case, tomb 3, only the very lowest part of the chamber surviving with one solitary pot. Tomb 2 here, the smallest among the significant tomb complexes, was found virtually empty and was perhaps never used. The others all seem to have been looted at unknown periods. So of course we have to bear in mind that although they contain quite a good number and range of pottery and some other objects, we will never know what the full original contents were. For example, tomb 1, among the usual range of Cypriot wares, with, for example, some fine big white slip craters, plus very few bronze and ivory artifacts, had one complete Mycenaean alabastron and a few Mycenaean sherds from a larger vessel. So we might like to count it as a medium rich tomb with only a couple of Mycenaean pots, and the same goes for bronze and ivory. But if it was looted, for example, in the late 19th century AD, Mycenaean vessels and other more precious materials would likely have been selectively removed, while what we think of as attractive Cypriot pottery was left behind. The contents had been left in a scattered mess, and there was no trace of the original spatial arrangement of the 9 individuals who could be identified. Skulls were found around the tomb walls. There are several marked by SK on the plan, perhaps thrown there by looters. At least, all that used to be our interpretation, but recently there's been a lot of discussion of secondary burials, and this has drawn attention to the practice of keeping only or mainly skulls to represent individuals, indeed often placing them around the sides of a tomb. So tomb 1 needs a bit of reconsideration. The nearby tomb 4, with its late Cypriot 2A early material, the earliest so far excavated, had been looted, if that is what happened, rather than a selective late Bronze Age clean-out, much more neatly, with a dense pile of vessels carefully pushed to one side, presumably having been checked over and discarded. Nevertheless, there were white slip craters with base-ring cups still inside them, ready to serve something to drink, an arrangement which we find in other tombs also. Apart from the pottery, there were only 3 spindle whorls and a cylinder seal, and we assume that at least some other objects have been lost to looters. There's no Mycenaean pots, which might be because they've been selectively looted, but the relatively early date of the tomb means you would expect much less Mycenaean at that period in late Cypriot 2A. A contrasting example, tomb 6, found during early excavations in the southeast area, which was excavated in more normal fashion rather than by dodging bulldozers, had a meaningful stratigraphic position, and is one of only 2 large chambers which we have found completely sealed and undisturbed. The other is tomb 11. Dating to late Cypriot 2C, into the side of a natural gully which was afterwards leveled with a stony fill containing many sherds, some of them of rare or high-class wares which must derive from looting of earlier tombs nearby. This was a medium-sized chamber of 6.8 square meters, created for the burial of only 1 adult and 1 extremely incomplete child, although it was likely intended to be reopened for further interments later, and was sealed with a gypsum slab. The grave goods comprised, where are they? Disappeared. The grave goods comprised only 7 not very exciting pots, which did include 2 plainware craters, each with a base ring cup inside as drink serving sets, plus 2 small Mycenaean alabastra and a monochrome jug. While not exactly glamorous, this is an important example of what was provided in a poorer tomb. There's lots of space for more grave goods, but there aren't any. And the emphasis is on serving drinks, if little else. The biggest tomb complex at the site, 23 square meters altogether, because it's the only one with 2 large chambers opening from the same dromos, is late Cypriot 2C tomb 1819-20 in the northwest part of the site. This was found accidentally when a tractor collapsed part of tomb 18's chamber roof. Tomb 18 had been looted and probably reused in Cypro-geometric period and possibly later periods, but tomb 19 at the other end of the dromos showed almost no sign of such disturbance. Tomb 18 is very well cut and symmetrical, with a deep, narrow, rectangular central depression flanked by benches and a circular alcove at the end, opposite the entrance. The bones of 8 individuals, 5 adults and 3 children, studied by Sherry Fox, were somewhat better preserved than is usual at the site, we assume because it's entirely cut in limestone. It's a pity then that we have felt obliged to exclude them from overall study of the late Bronze Age people, because later material of Iron Age and later was found in most contexts in the tomb, although in small quantity. But the barrel-shaped Cypro-geometric juglet certainly looks like something that could have been a tomb offering. However, definitely most of the contents date to late Cypriot 2C. A few of the finds, including a couple of gold and silver small items, suggest that it may have been a fairly rich tomb originally. Tomb 19, being smaller and more irregular in shape, seems likely to have been created after Tomb 18, although this can't be proved. The Tomb 18-19 complex was found just below the topsoil in the northwestern part of the site, where we haven't yet excavated properly. And it's an area where indications are that no late Cypriot architecture now survives, although we think it once existed. So the presence of this big tomb complex tends to confirm that the town extended this far. In such a case, it would be most interesting if geophysical methods could detect the presence of tomb chambers, unencumbered by overlying architecture or debris, to provide evidence concerning the distribution and orientation of tombs. In fact, a small test was carried out by Sturt Manning and Tommy Urban and was promising. Having completed that quick glance through tombs found in various areas, you'll be glad to know that we'll now turn to the northeast area, where the deeper stratigraphy and more extensive excavation allow a much better appreciation of how the tombs relate to each other and to the architecture. Several of the important tombs here were found under the streets west and south of Building 10. Building 10, this square thing, the large ashlar building. In the streets here, we have mostly reached bedrock, and that's partly why the tombs seem to be only in the street. It's partly because we haven't excavated to bedrock in other surrounding areas. We either didn't reach bedrock because of lack of time, or in some cases, Department of Antiquities has asked us to leave the flaws and interesting features in situ. So be aware that there may be many more tombs undiscovered underneath this area. There were industrial buildings over here on the west. This shows the 13th century or late 13th century plan. There was an earlier phase on very similar alignment, and Building 10 was at least partly rebuilt for the last phase. And there was a still earlier phase of approximately late Cypriot 2A on a different alignment, of which we've only uncovered a certain limited amounts. You can best recognize it in this long wall on a different alignment underneath the 13th century street. This wall isn't hugely impressive in width, but it's 25 meters extent of unbroken wall. So that's just fairly substantial building. Two of the tombs, Tomb 16 up there and Tomb 11 are on this earlier alignment. That is, the sides of their dromi are on that alignment. And they are the earliest, both stratigraphically and by stylistic dating of their material. Tomb 16, no, it's like that. was looted or cleaned out when a massive LC2C wall was built partly over it. However, the very rich Tomb 11 was left sealed and undisturbed when a 13th century wall was built right along the edge of its dromos, presumably indicating respect for the ancestors who lay within it. A bit further south in the street, there's an intriguing feature, corner of a very huge pit cut in the hard Havara bedrock, and it goes underneath the enormous west wall of Building 10 and was partly very thoroughly packed with stones. So very tempting to think this is an enormous dromos, but this is not certain. Further south, tombs 13, 14, and 21 conform to the later orientation of architecture, but were first created during the earliest part of it. In this fireman's ladder view of part of the area, tomb 16, the early one looted or cleaned out, is underneath the later street surface up here, and the rich tomb 11 is there in the street, and tombs 13, 14, 21 and subsidiaries were here. This is the southwest corner of Building 10, and they are in a bigger part of the street which heads away off and goes at least a couple of 100 meters to the south through the domestic buildings of the settlement. In the extreme, I'll perhaps go back a second. In the extreme northeast corner of the northeast area, we found by chance in a sort of eroded hole in the slope at the edge of the site what seemed to be a lovely sealed tomb, tomb 8. There it is, looks beautiful, slab in place and sealed with chopping stones. So that initially promised discovery of a complete tomb chamber, but it turned out both most of the dromos and most of the chamber had been heavily eroded or destroyed by various modern and ancient leveling operations. So its interest is only that there was once a tomb there, and it's one that faces to the east, not to the south, like Building 10, like the others in the northeast area. Now I'm going to talk about these tombs more mainly from the slides, so we hope I won't lose myself. Lindy, by the way, you're going to have to warn me when I'm approaching the end, because I have actually got nothing I can see that shows the time here. The little tomb 16, which had not much contents left in it, but a few scraps of bone and pottery, had its top cut off by leveling to build 13th century buildings later. But in the side of the surviving lowest part of the side of its dromos, underneath this later wall, there was a nice little dromos niche, which was sealed with a sweet little slab with little chinking stones. And most of these dromos niches we found were empty, except one or two had some scraps of adolescents in them. This one had a complete infant, and there wasn't room for any offerings such as a white slip bowl, which is something we quite often find with infants or children, but there was one white slip sherd, possibly supposed to represent white slip bowl. And the next tomb to the south, under the street and just outside what is now Building 10, the rich and fairly well-known Tomb 11, was sort of kidney-shaped with a bit of a buttress here to partly support the chamber roof, and a rock-cut bench at each side, wider on the left, which is the west, and on this side, a complete skeleton 1, had been laid out and was found anatomically complete, virtually, with jewellery in situ, many gold earrings and a couple of necklaces around her neck, 2 signet rings on her, in the area of her right arm, which had been partly disturbed or fallen off the bench, and silver rings on her toes. On the opposite bench were bones which, as you can see, they look like, well, they are long bones paired up, but Jack Moyer soon found that they're paired up wrong anatomically. So they're a secondary burial, but they've been arranged to kind of look like arms and legs. And there are parts of 2 skeletons on this bench, one approaching complete and one mainly the skull only. At the time of excavation, we were very much wedded to the idea that somebody was buried first on the wider west bench, and then if the tomb was reopened to bury somebody else, they were moved over to the other bench neatly. But of course, it is equally possible or likely that the 2 on the east bench here are secondary burials. All the stylistic dating of the grave goods falls neatly within a period in the late 14th century or so. So either it could have been opened once or twice for new adult burials, or the adults were all placed in the same time. There's a child on the floor, and there are 3 infants buried together in a clump, perhaps in a basket or bundle, and they were definitely put in later. The big tomb was reopened for them because they were on top of a certain thickness of silt which had accumulated in the tomb after the burials and grave goods were put there. And these 3 infants had a nice set of 3 more or less identical white slip bowls. There are 2 and one had slid down there. They're very, very similar, look like they're all made at the same time. So again, white slip bowls with tiny newborns or perinatal babies, who of course would hardly be able to drink out of a complete white slip bowl, but the white slip bowls maybe were symbolic of what they were going to use as they grew up. 2 Mycenaean craters, again, found with bastering cups placed inside them, ready to serve something nice to drink, and a lot of pottery, including a great amount of red lustrous wheel-made ware. Red lustrous spindle bottles were just in front of or even leaning up against the east bench, and other grave goods, including ivories and glass, on the floor. The rich jewellery, these secondary burials on the east bench had an equal amount of jewellery to skeleton 1. So if they were secondary, their jewellery had been kept with them and they still had it with them. This tomb, I may say, was originally going to be published a whole volume by itself. So I have to try and summarize it in 5 minutes. Objects on the floor, including matched a lot of the pots were in matching sets, very elegant, not a huge number of pots, but an elegant selection. A nice pair of base ring bull writer, red lustrous ware, a set of base ring pedestal bowls like cake stands, one of the Mycenaean Craters, together with bones and other items in front of the east bench, which had the secondary burials on it. A small selection of pottery. This top left indicates the range of wares. The two very large base ring bull writer, the Mycenaean Craters with elegant motifs of fish, or, well, they're shown jumping over each other like dolphins, although they don't have dolphin big fin on the top of their backs. And lilies, very elegant and suitable to the young ladies who were buried in the tomb. The 3 adult skeletons were all young women. There was a large amount of red lustrous wheel-made ware. Sorry, this is a black and white slide, which seems to be the only one I had. The red lustrous, sometimes complete in good condition, but you see many, many necks of spindle wattles here. So the percentage of red lustrous ware among the pots is about the highest anywhere in Cyprus, I think, although the number of them is much less than at Kalavasos, where there was a huge amount. And quick glimpse of some of the jewellery and plain hoop earrings of solid gold, different kinds of beads, including these, well, beads or pendants that could be sewn onto the edge of something. They're only 3 millimeters long, and with them were circular disc beads only about 1 millimeter diameter. Ivory objects of the kind so often found in Cyprus and the Levant, with decorated discs, which should be the lids and bases of cylindrical pyxides or makeup containers or something like that. There were 2 ivory ducks in tomb 11, also thought to be for cosmetics. They're hollow in the back, and when complete had a lid in the shape of wings which could swivel to the side. 2 Egyptian little glass bottles, and there were also some faience and glass beads. And more about jewellery. These plain but heavy hoop earrings, and some of them go around in 2 turns, as maybe hair rings of some kind. And Elizabeth Goring's work on the jewellery showed that, firstly, most of it has signs of wear, so it belonged to skeletons 1 and 3 and had been used in life. And these standardized ones have standardized weights, which evidently the goldsmith was given a certain weight and asked to make it into 6 pairs or whatever. There are a few other examples of this found in Cyprus and in the Near East, and I happened to find a text referring to the same thing at the Palace of Moroni for a princess there. Heavy gold bracelets. These are plain sort of hoops with very fine incision, and an unusual one of this open work. Skeleton one had 2 seal rings with Cypriot inscriptions and other symbols. Elsewhere in the tomb there was something with Egyptian symbols, but perhaps not really, possibly something copied somewhere outside Egypt. And a double-sided stamp seal to be published by the late Edith Parada. So we have young women with a very rich collection of gold that was taken out of circulation by being buried with them. And skeleton one, well, she was perhaps literate, or at any rate, something about her rank and position in life required that she have a seal ring and a stamped seal. One of the most, well, or the most unique object in the tomb, this silver, glass, gold, and copper pyxis. It's in shape just like the ivory ones. Was found right next to its lid, which was separate, and it has gold foil decorative bands around it. There's another view of the lid that was there. There's a cylinder of what looks like silver with glass outside it. This is the part of the base that's stuck, corroded in it. The other part of the base was smashed. You can see in a few places fairly bright blue color. That I don't think anybody else that we have found yet had one of those. So this is a rare sealed example of a tomb used for quite a short time, with everybody in it left just as they were at the time of the last burial. And rushing on further south down the street, tomb 13, a large, more or less circular chamber with a stone-built bench along the west side. In these northeast area tombs, all the big prestigious ones had benches, and where there was a skeleton in situ, it was always on the west bench with head towards the entrance or towards the light or the morning light. The tomb 13 lady was still on her bench, although she looked a bit as if she'd been pushed around by tomb looters. This one was not sealed, but had been looted right at the end of the life of the site. We could see the looters cut through part of the dromos fill, sloping down directly to the tomb entrance. They obviously knew where it was. And it seems that they did a hasty loot and just tossed everything around. However, we found a large number of small gold jewellery items still remaining. And after that looting, the dromos was completely covered and sealed by falling mud bricks from the abandoned buildings on each side of the street where the tomb was. So these pots, an alabaster vessel, and a glass flask, it's tempting to think they were put there together with the skeleton, but they're actually just as they were left by disturbance and looting. Except that next to her head, there was a sort of clay slab which had a neat depression in it for something to be stood in it or poured into it. And maybe you can see there were 3 little daggers lying there. This tomb was provided with a nice built ramp to help get in and out, which is the only time we found such a feature. Some of the tombs had either toe holds or rudimentary steps, but normally to get in, you have to kind of jump down or take a huge step down onto the floor of the chamber. But this is a very convenient arrangement. And here are some of the disarranged bones of altogether about a dozen people of various ages who were found mixed up on the floor, mostly on the east side opposite the bench with the middle-aged lady in situ. This tomb seemed to have been used over a long period of time. There were a few things in it, going back perhaps to late Cypriot 2A, most of it was 2B and 2C. And we could see cuts in the adjacent floors that showed the tomb had been reopened several times. And indeed, we had some joins between sherds found in the tomb, the dromos, and surrounding areas. So there was a lot of mixing up and material going in and out of the tomb at certain times. This slide shows much of the Mycenaean found in the tomb, which was by far the largest amount we found in any tomb, about half of all the pottery, although there was plenty of fine Cypriot pottery as well. 3 complete Mycenaean craters, 2 with octopus, this one with crazy dotted eyes, and another crater which has scenes of horses going towards a building that appears to be a shrine with horns of consecration on top and a lady inside with circular motifs hanging from the ceiling or hanging on the front. So is that a goddess in her shrine? A very unusual item again. And this tomb again.
Alison.
Yep. What's time?
2 minutes, please.
Oh dear. Okay.
It's fine, though. You can go longer. It's absolutely fine.
Well, I'll go a bit longer, but I'll try and hurry up through the slides. All these elite tombs have the similar overall repertoire of Mycenaean pottery and fine Cypriot golds and a little silver jewellery, fine ivory objects, these stylized border held earrings in tomb 13, red luster square. But each tomb may have certain more unusual or unique items. A subsidiary chamber off the same dromos was used for a child and infants, a very clear example of this, and it was found sealed, not disturbed by looters, with a modest collection of pottery, some of which are clearly miniatures suitable for a child, and this wildly unusual silver figurine of a Hittite god, obviously a small object that could be passed around as gifts or in trade. Silver being more valuable than gold in much of the period. Anyway, the 2 other nearby tombs, tomb 14, here a few highlights: red lustrous arm-shaped vessels, a unique white slip crater with pictorial decoration, small Mycenaean crater, a glass and vase gaming board, and near it, tomb 21, another one with a narrow central depression and a big bench each side. Now, tomb 14 and 21, I must take the time to mention, they had been looted or more likely deliberately cleaned out as a late Bronze Age rearrangement of the people who were buried in them. Tomb 14's burials had been mainly moved off the bench, perhaps in preparatory to giving it a really thorough clean out, and the pottery was found just inside the entrance in a heap. Tomb 21, even more clearly, enormous heap of sherds that had been thrown back in through the entrance, but could mostly be restored to make, for example, this one of the world's biggest Mycenaean craters with fine chariots. It holds 54.5 litres of wine if filled to the brim, which would make 66 modern wine bottles. The other Mycenaean crater, not quite so huge, but again, a very unusual procession of ladies on it. And there were gold diadems. You see the huge crater there. And again, many of these pots were in sets, such as this very matching set of base ring jugs there of base ring 1 style with the rope decoration, but we find these often in contexts which should really be late Cypriot too. B and C. It seems they kept making them as special things for tombs, perhaps. So it's very tempting to see a procession of ladies bringing these to the tomb. So very rich tombs grouped around this important building, and perhaps earlier versions in an important building in the earliest period. And they all face to the south, like the building does. So we have lots of evidence about the people and their rich grave goods and their international connections of some kind. And which raises the question, what did they have to give in exchange for all these imported items, or items made perhaps in Cyprus but of imported materials, such as gold and ivory? We have often said, I've said many times in the past, well, they were probably trading copper from Kalavasos mines. We have some evidence for metallurgy in the settlement, but not in very big quantity. However, during the time since we started excavating the site, Noel and Sophie Gale came out with the results that they said suggested that Kalavasos mining area was not and could not have been used in the late Bronze Age because of the type of ores and their analyses. And recently, Lenta van Bremt was doing her PhD at the Cyprus University, partly on the metallurgy of Ayios Dhimitrios. And she tended to, I think, confirm the same, that metalwork and slag found at KAD may not be from Kalavasos mines, although this work is still ongoing and is being prepared for publication. But overall, the most important is the big picture of, let's say, the tombs and the great administrative building in a large settlement, lots of international connections. How does that fit with the big picture in Cyprus as a whole? The usual question, was there a king of Al-Ashir? And if so, if he was at Enkami, then how come that this site and others, Moroni, Alisa, Kuklia, Halasultan, Teke, etc., how come they got their hands on so much wealth if the trade was in the hand of a centralized king? So the tombs will play a big part in all this, and you'll be glad to know that's the end. So hope you have plenty of questions and helpful suggestions.
Thank you so much, Alison. That's amazingly interesting, and there must be a lot of questions. Do we have, Alison, well, actually, let's leave your slides up for now, just in case we do have people who are curious about certain objects, but I have a lot of questions. Is there anyone who would like to start by asking a question? Okay, I will kick it off while people have a bit of a think. Or Diane, you're looking like you're ready or not quite ready. Anyway, Nancy is giving us a message. She needs to leave for a meeting, but your lecture was so informative and beautifully illustrated. Most fondly, Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. And also apologies from Kate, who had to go off and teach as well, but she enjoyed what she saw. I was really curious when you mentioned that you have, like, the dromoi were being refilled between interments, and you said, I think you had some evidence from tomb 13 of recutting through the streets. Did you manage to get sort of evidence from other tombs as well that the dromoi were being refilled between interments? Because we don't see, or we couldn't see that evidence at Enkami, and that would be super interesting.
Well, if they reused the tomb several times, of course, they kept cutting down sort of on top of the earlier cuts, you know, so you might not always be able to see it clearly. In tomb 13, we could see several cuts through previous floors of the street, or the earlier, it may not have been a street in the earliest ones. Tomb 13 as far as we know, they didn't do a late Bronze Age deliberate cleaning out to, as they did with some tombs, perhaps to bury the bones as secondary burial somewhere else. That's a whole big question that I didn't say much about. It was very clear that there was a looter's cut through the dromos fill. They didn't bother to clean out the dromos completely. They just sloped down to the tomb entrance, went in, looted it messily, and then their cut, the whole dromos was filled up with fallen mud bricks, very clear from the buildings on each side of the street. But that's quite different from the late Bronze Age cleaning out of the nearby tomb 14 and 21, which happened at the same time as each other because there are some shared joins across the way.
I think Diane has her hand raised. Would you like to ask a question, Diane?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hi, Alison. Hope to see you in a few weeks. I'm coming to Cyprus in early October. And thank you for your wonderful lecture. I was just curious about whether in the final analysis there are any new thoughts about gender constructs at the site in terms of the burials. And, you know, apart from Tomb 11, for example, are there many other burials where women are associated clearly with high status objects? Are there differences between male and female? Are there any new thoughts on any of these topics?
Well, in many cases, bones are not in good condition. I think the only one that was sexed from her pelvis was the one in Tomb 11. But there are several others which have been identified as female. The one in Tomb 13 also, so that's 2 women on the benches in very prestigious tombs. Tomb 14, if I remember from Jack's report, was a probable male. So, well, you've got a couple of tombs where women seem to have been very well treated. And I should say, although you all know already, of course, probably, that the grave goods, so-called, they're very much things for sort of the good life of having a good meal and nice toiletries and things. They're not objects of daily life and work at all. I mean, in the settlement, the great majority of our finds, even in the late Bronze Age, are ground stone. You know, grinders, pestles, querns, etc., and a few loom weights, spindle whorls, etc., and that's exactly not what we find in the tombs. So the ladies were not expected to do that work. We occasionally find stone biconical spindle whorls. But whether it's just one very good feast, you know, to give them a good send-off, and then they were vaguely expected to keep enjoying that forevermore, or what exactly is going on, it's not really possible to tell. I also omitted to mention that we certainly find animal bones, meat joints of goat and lamb and game birds, and fish bones of the same kind of fish that you would eat in the fish restaurants with Ziggy nowadays in the tombs.
Well, thanks. It'd be great if you manage eventually to get some DNA evidence. You might be able to, you know, stretch these sorts of analyses a bit further.
Well, we certainly hope to try, but as I say, it's been a bit slowed up by present
Well,
circumstances.
Even without COVID, it's difficult to get DNA evidence out of a lot of
Yes, I know. Yeah.
a lot of material, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
See you soon.
A few messages. Sophocles Hadjisavis says, thank you so much, Alison. He has to leave. He sends greetings to all. Christine Morris says, thank you so much, as does Maria Belgiano. We have Sophia Butaleb with her hand raised. Sophia, you'd like to, ask your question?
Thank you. Hi, Alison. I'm a master's student at UBC, and this was a very exciting talk as my master's thesis is actually about Tomb 11. So this was the best talk I could attend. But please correct me if I'm wrong. Building 10 was aligned later with Tomb 11. Is that right? My question is, do you think that possibly the wealth attributed to Tomb 11 or Skeleton 1 could have been connected in any way with the olive oil industry or that kind of aspect of the economy at the time?
Well, Tomb 11 is earlier than the buildings and floors that we have, with a lot of evidence for olive oil industry. So we have in the earlier phase, Tomb 11 and some scraps of walls and things that we have are aligned a bit more around to the west. And then, well, building 10 and other buildings on that, in that part of the site continued roughly the same alignment, but changed it slightly, with building 10, a very important building facing south, which is a good way to do it because then you get the most light into your big building. So there's a long continuity there. I mean, it's building 10 and its contemporary buildings are sort of following the alignment of the earlier tombs and earlier buildings. We used to think, well, when excavating Tomb 11 and shortly afterwards, that it was a good subject for a sort of exam question. How many different interpretations, can you think of for this? And we tried making up various stories as to what order things had happened in Tomb 11.
That's great. Thank you so much.
But do contact me if you've got more questions.
I will. I'll contact you after this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Peter Fisher, you're next, please. Well, you need to unmute, I think.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Alison, for your very interesting presentation. I just wonder, do you have any statistics about the red lustrous wheelmate? You said there were quite a lot. Can you give me a number?
Wait a minute, I know this, but I've forgotten. In Tomb 11, there were 20 something, like 22 or 23 vessels, which is a very high percentage of all the vessels in that tomb. I think it's 40% of the pottery in the tomb, but of course that's not a huge number compared to what have been found in some other places such as Kazaphony, and other tombs have smaller numbers of them, like from, I don't know, perhaps from 3 to 8 in each tomb or something like that. But I could give you a better summary if you wanted to email me sometime.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to inform you about, we have just finished the excavation of Tomb RR at Hala Sultan Tekke.
Yeah.
And in Tomb RR, we have 76 skeletons.
Well,
it took us
very good.
It took us 4 years to excavate the
Yes.
tomb. And in the next to Tomb RR, there's Tomb SS with 11 skeletons. And interesting enough, that Tomb SS 5 by 4 meters, and this tomb with 76 skeletons is not larger than 3 by 2 meters. So they were piled upon each other.
Are those in those extended burials, or are they secondary burials or squashed up?
Both. Just the latest burials are complete, and the previous ones are, most of them are commingled. And to the discussion about DNA, we are at the moment processing some 40 partes petrose of Tomb RR and SS.
Yeah.
And we already have some very interesting results. But according to my collaborators, I'm not allowed to give you some pre-publication information, but we have some very interesting results from these two tombs which excavated between 2018 and 2021. So just since Diane talked about DNA, it's going on. It will be published very soon.
And how is the condition of the bones? Do they look to be better than ours, or?
No, maybe a little better, but not much better. So we have in tomb SS, we have 11 skeletons, and interesting enough, they are 90% are complete. But in tomb RR, where there are 76 skeletons, there just a few of them are complete, and most of them are committed, and the condition is from good to very bad. So
Yeah.
It's a mixture, and the soil is not very, let's say, very kind to the
Yes.
bone remains, unfortunately. Well, thank you very much again.
Thank you. That's extremely interesting.
Thank you. And Louise Steele has contributed in the chat that you perhaps might be able to find more information in the lustrous wares volume, Peter, on the red lustrous statistics as well.
But by the way, we have done a lot of petrography on red lustrous wheel-made ware, and all of them are from Anatolia.
Interesting.
Yes, we're assuming they're from there, yes.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you. And next, Thomas Humphrey has a question.
Alison, thanks for the talk. It was really fascinating. I was wondering if
could you speak up a little bit, please, Thomas? It's really hard to hear you.
Oh, sorry. I was wondering if you could, if you knew off the top of your head how many cylinder seals were found in the tombs. My internet is garbage. I will type it.
I couldn't hear it clearly.
I think he was asking how many cylinder seals all up were found at KAD.
At KAD overall, it's not that many, 6 or 7 in the whole site. I think it's only 3 in tombs. There's something you'd expect to find in the rich tombs, but of course some of them have been disturbed or looted. There was a stamp seal in tomb 11 and the signet rings that could be used to stamp something. There's a seal in tomb 13 and one in tomb 4 found in the motorway line, and I think there's the only ones in tombs.
Okay, does anyone have any further questions at this point? So just thank you. There are some greetings here, but I can pass those on to Alison. Sorry,
Stuart does.
Oh, Stuart does. Oh, your hand wasn't raised. Sorry.
I have raised it a number of times. Maybe you're looking elsewhere.
The icon. Go, Stuart, please.
Can I go ahead?
Yes.
Alison, my question's been partially answered already. I was going to mention the olive oil, which, of course, in the later building is a striking evidence for production. But I was interested when you said that all the copper, according to Gale and Co., this other person as well, whose name I forget now, was not being produced from Kalavasos. So what was their the source of their wealth? I was wondering, could they have been exporting olive oil to Egypt? The olive tree supposedly doesn't grow in Egypt, and your gold presumably came from Egypt, didn't it?
Well, they might have been. I know there are some, I mean, there's some evidence for olives in Egypt, but maybe they were rare and special. We do find, for what it's worth, we have quite a lot of Canaanite jar sherds from exactly those areas around Building 10, where the olive oil production is. They haven't been analysed in a big way yet, so I don't mean to say that they were definitely made in Canaan, but they're Canaanite type, transport amphorae. And they're mostly very fragmentary, so we have very few restorable, so they're not sort of that well known. But yes, I mean, that's certainly a possibility. Otherwise, what were they doing with all this oil? I mean, using it perhaps to some extent to give it out in rations to people who were working in the immediate area, and it's something perishable. You have to know what you're going to do with it, because in a year or two it will go off and then you can't sell it anymore. They obviously knew what they were collecting it for.
Well, anyhow, thank you. It was a great lecture, and as someone who, you know, I saw you starting there, I was around my whole family at times, helping now and again, and I really enjoyed your summary.
Yes, the family helping when they were very young, yes.
Very young, and now they're in their mid to late 40s.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, but if anyone else has their actual hand raised, when the screen is being shared, I can't see anyone except those who use the icon to raise their hand. So sorry about that. And Louise Steele now has her hand raised. Louise, please.
Hi, thank you, Lindy. Thank you, Alison. That was a lovely paper. I really enjoyed it. It's nice to be back in Cyprus. Of course, it's got to be pottery. So I was struck by you mentioning how what you find in the tombs isn't what you find on the settlements. And I was thinking again about the pottery. You get lots of really lovely, quite unusual things like the base ring stands. Those are really unusual. And I was thinking also the sets of pots as well, especially in Tomb 11, things have sort of seem to be accumulated in groups. And I was just wondering, how much of this stuff do you think is just being accumulated by the mourners, the people who are left behind as gifts, rather than anything to actually do with the person who's been buried? Sort of
well, that's a burning question that Priscilla, of course, interested herself a lot in how worn or not worn, you know, vessels and tombs were and so on. I think we're a teeny bit cynical about that due to them perhaps being clumped around in the tombs in reuse and looting and getting limey incrustations on them. But some of these sets, it's not only Tomb 11, but well, to some extent, yes, Tomb 14 and 13 and Tomb 21 with its huge set of matched base ring jugs and so on. So those sets were obviously made as a set, you know, so if it was just people who came to the funeral each bringing one pot, it wouldn't have turned out like that. But whether they were commissioned for the funeral or they were something very special, you know, that was in the family, well, I'm afraid we don't know, you know, unless we excavate lots and lots of well-preserved tombs and see if we get any hints. But some of them are certainly very special, and we think, you know, just for funerary use. In Tomb 21, which had been very much cleaned out, but in the late Bronze Age, and perhaps for a cleaning out for secondary burial rather than looting, it seemed to us, our feeling, for what it's worth, was that all the things that were thrown back into the tomb in a great heap were mainly ones that were very much for special or funerary use. Mycenaean Craters, the big set of base ring jugs, and various other things. And so perhaps, you know, it was either forbidden to use them in life, or you couldn't use them in life because everyone would know you'd stolen them from the tomb, or I don't know what, but something going on there, we think.
That's great. Thank you.
There's a much smaller but very select group of things. You know, it's enough to make a good display, but it's rather overkill in some of the other tombs. But
some of them look like they were quite pristine. Some of the nice space when you showed from Tomb 11, that looked really pristine and sort of as though it's just special for the tomb.
Yeah,
that's great. Thank you, Alison.
Okay, thank you. We don't seem to have any more questions as now, but we can, what we can do is end the formal part of this, and I can press stop on the record button, and then anyone who would like to turn on their cameras and everything. But once again, let's thank Alison South very much for a fascinating lecture, and we all enjoyed that very much. And we hope to see you all again soon for our next lecture in early October by Dr. Erin Everett. Thank you so much for coming along tonight.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody.